Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics, where I'm going to do something we've never done on this channel before. Right here I have 10 lovely classic books which I picked up for £5 for all of them. And I've not read a single one of them, and I'm going to show them to you. One, to ask which one of them have you read, which of them have you never read, but more importantly I want you to vote on which one of these I should read next month and then report back to you on it. I'm going to go through them, give you a synopsis from my own research, starting with the oldest one, going to the most recent one. So, having said all that, let's tuck in, shall we? So the first book on our list is written in 1859, and it might surprise you that I haven't read this one, because it comes from that great English authoress, George Eliot, and it is her first novel, Adam Bede. Now, I just want to say one thing here. You may think I'm going to say I'm ashamed that I've never read this. Never be ashamed of the books you haven't read. Rather, be pleased and content with the books that you have. As long as you take the time to think over them and to draw something out of them, most books are worth the journey, especially amongst the classics. And know that you can never get through, unless you're one prolific reader, you'll never get through all of the books that are, supposedly the greatest works, because there are lots of them. So, having said that, Adam Bede, of course, probably all of us know the name of this book. He is the carpenter who is the eponymous character from whom the book is named. He's the carpenter in a small Warwickshire village in 1799 when the story starts, called Hayslope, which is a lovely, quintessentially British sounding name. Now, Adam Bede falls in love with a character called Hetty Sorrel. She's sort of the village beauty, but she has had her head turned by the young squire, what's his name? Arthur Donnithorne, I believe his name is. And the story follows that. Now, I've done a little bit of research, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, even though I haven't read the whole thing, so I'll be careful with what I say. But the story itself was taken from a real-time event, where George Eliot had learned from her auntie, I believe it was, who used to be an evangelist. Of a story about a woman she met in prison. I'm not going to say too much because it would give something away about the book. And her auntie actually plays a role as one of the characters in this. She is Dinah Morris, who shares comfort and faith with everybody. But the book's not about that. The book is a tragedy. And yet it's that merging which has continually been developing through literature of comedy with tragedy, because that is how life is. Whereas traditionally the books are written to be either comedy books or tragedy books. That blending is part of the social realism that's coming into literature, and of which George Eliot is a massive forerunner of. She really introduces the full realist novel to the British literary scene. And so the story will follow her and the travails that she goes through. There's quite the severe plot twist, as it were, something you will not see coming. And will there be a happy ending between Adam Bede and Hetty Sorrel? You'll have to read it to find out. Now, to help you make your choice in what I should read next month, I'm going to read the first paragraph, as is my penchant in a lot of these videos, so that you can get a flavour for the writing. Chapter 1, The Workshop. With a single drop of ink for a mirror, the Egyptian sorcerer undertakes to reveal to any chance comer far-reaching visions of the past. This is what I undertake to do for you, reader. With this drop of ink at the end of my pen, I will show you the roomy workshop of Mr. Jonathan Burge, carpenter and builder in the village of Hayslope, as it appeared on the 18th of June in the year of our Lord, 1799. So the second book on our list is a rather well-known and, dare I say, renowned book. Some have called this the greatest novel written in the 19th century. Some call it the most influential novel over all novels of all countries in the 19th century. And it is Gustave Flaubert's 1869 novel, Sentimental Education. He wrote this after Madame Bovary and apparently rises to preeminence in his writing in this book. So, something that's written on the back of this old edition is a quote by Flaubert, and this really attracted me. He says, I know nothing more noble than the contemplation of the world. I agree with that. I don't think there is either. To contemplate the world, to see, to observe. In my Patreon group, we are currently reading books based upon the authors who are very good observers of the real world around us, and hence why realism is born pretty much from Flaubert as one of the great early writers of it. So the story itself focuses on our main character, a young man in 1848, which is, you know, was that the Second Revolution in France? Frederick Moreau. And what Gustave Flaubert said he was trying to do was to capture the morals, the emotions, I think he said, of his generation as best as he could. And Frederick Moreau is quite a romantic. He goes into high flights of fancy, mainly towards the past. But the story revolves around him and a woman he meets early on in the book. And then when he moves from his village to Paris with a letter of recommendation to a banker from an old childhood friend of his, he actually goes to this shop owned by Monsieur Arnaud, and lo and behold, Monsieur Arnaud's wife, Madame Arnaud, is the woman he had met earlier, who had had an effect on him. Now, it's a story of a young man's infatuation and love for an older woman. You see him move through Paris with great observation. Now, how can I say that I've not read it? I have read passages from Sentimental Education. Whenever you read university kind of books that talk about the development of the novel or how to write, or this book is frequently quoted. Some say he introduces the idea of the panning camera shot, which captures a multiple number of things which a protagonist can't see all at once. So you might be going down a street and see someone beating out the rug of dust out there. But a bit further down, maybe there's a wet, lank flag hanging. And then a bit further on, the clink of cutlery being washed in a cafe. Well, that can't all happen simultaneously to the protagonist, but Flaubert captures the whole scene with all this constant movement in one snippet. And that is known as one of the big strides forward in the development of realist literature. So obviously I'd love to read all of that and get familiar with it. But the story isn't just about that love of a younger man towards an older woman, that infatuation. It's got the politics of the day. Here, Frederick is a student, so he's embroiled in the thoughts and the high utopian dreams of the young ones, which never changes through history. But also the seediness of some parts of it, the corruption, the infidelity between friends and between people who are married, and then the thwarting of your chances, of your desires, the movement and the changeability of a person's character, especially, I suppose, when young and affected by high flights of fancy and romance. So all of that comes into the book, but it's pinned around this one dynamic of Frederick and Madame Arnaud. So now let's read the opening. On the 15th of September 1840, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the Ville de Montereau was lying alongside the Quai Saint-Bernard, ready to sail, with clouds of smoke pouring from its funnel. People came hurrying up out of breath. Barrels, ropes, and baskets of washing lay about in everybody's way. The sailors ignored all inquiries. People bumped into one another. The pile of baggage between the two paddle wheels grew higher and higher, and the din merged into the hissing of the steam, which, escaping through some iron plates, wrapped the whole scene in a whitish mist, while the bell in the bows went on clanging incessantly. At last, the boat moved off, and the two banks, lined with warehouses, yards, and factories, slipped past like two wide ribbons being unwound. I love that opening, and you can see that sort of motion captured scene, snapshot of a scene, but still simultaneously moving with tons of bustle going on in there. I absolutely am thrilled with that opening. So that was our second one, Gustave Flaubert's Sentimental Education, known as his greatest work, and some say the most influential work of the 19th century. So the third classic book on our list was written between the years 1883 and 1885 by the very famous philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, or Nietzsche. And it is Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now, I believe from my research that Thus Spake Zarathustra is Nietzsche's only novel, and it's a philosophical novel. Some say that the idea of it was for him to incorporate or encapsulate a lot of his philosophical musings, his ideas, within the format of a dialogue, which would make it easier to express the philosophies that he had. It's very much in the sort of idea of the ancient Greeks, who often used to use dialogues of people talking, because that way you could have the philosophy and someone reason against it and hear the arguments to take that idea forward. So that's what you get in this. And Zarathustra, in this book, he starts as a hermit up a mountain with his two pets, a snake and an eagle. And he eventually learns from the sun that the sun is only happiest when it shines on others. And so he decides to descend the mountain and start sharing his lessons and his wisdom with other people. Now, in those lessons, you will find a lot of Nietzsche's own ideas, because that's the purpose of this book. So you get the idea of God is dead. You get the idea of the Übermensch. You get the idea of the will to power. Things that you'll find in much of his works. And you obviously will get a people's reaction to his message. So it takes, I love this because I'm a firm believer that novels are philosophy's critics. Because Dostoevsky showed this. You can take the philosophies of people and they'll all work pristine in a philosophical treatise because you're in control. An author with a philosophical treatise is like a god. They can manipulate the world to be and behave and act the way their theory wants it to. Put it in a novel and things change a little bit. So you'll get here Nietzsche creating reactions from people listening. You'll get people just sneering at his ideas, scoffing at his ideas, as things carry on. And of course he challenges a lot of the status quo in this book. I know for certain that, there's an argument against Christian morality inside this book, which again is part of Nietzsche's own thinking. So the reason it's called Thus Spake Zarathustra, by the way, is at the end of each treatise or chapter where he's been talking with others, it's been recorded, and it nearly always ends with Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is where the title of the book comes from. Let's read the first paragraph, shall we? Zarathustra's prologue. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he abandoned his home and the lake of his home and went into the mountains. Here he enjoyed his spirit and his solitude, and for 10 years did not tire of them. At last, however, there was a change in his heart. And so, one morning with the dawn of morning, he rose, stepped out before the sun, and spoke to it thus. Greetings, great star. What would your happiness be, were it not for those whom you illumine? And thus spake Zarathustra. Now, the fourth book on our list does somewhat titillate my fancy, and it's from an author I've never read from before, a great French author, André Gide. Both these books are written in the 1910s. I think they were written very close to each other, 1911, I think it was. And they are La Symphonie Pastorale and Isabelle. Two novellas. Look how small this book is. But I do sometimes like a novella because you get the intensity of a single idea that the author wants to share with you, and keeps it wrapped finely around, the crux of one topic without much deviation. And that tends to add a certain piquancy to storytelling. So, from what I've read of these two, La Symphonie Pastorale, this is named after Beethoven's Sixth, the Pastoral Symphony. And it is of a blind girl called Gertrude, who a pastor takes in with pity and starts to educate her and raise her along with his 5 children. But there's a question about the ability of the girl to see mentally and of the pastor's blindness to his own maybe intellectual dishonesty or even emotional dishonesty, because his wife begins to get jealous that pays more attention to this young girl, Gertrude, than to the rest of his 5 children. And he wants to help her grow, and he wants to keep her pure, and he teaches her about sin and vice and not going near those. But nonetheless, there's the question mark of how he begins to feel, because his eldest boy also starts falling in love with Gertrude. And there's quite a reaction from the pastor to that. And then you'll get the fallout. Now, I've researched a little bit of where it goes from there, but I don't want to say any more because it's a novella, so that would be giving probably too much away. But it is an exploration of how we love people, and how we sometimes deal with that internally with ourselves. I've heard there's nothing inappropriate in this, but it's quite a deep exploration, really. It's one of those short things you can read quickly, but lingers the more with you if you give it time. So that's the first of the 2 novellas in this short book. That's La Symphonie Pastorale. Now, the other one is also about love, but a really, really intriguing idea. And again, it comes from a person who's very in touch with emotions and the behaviours of individuals, because it seems such an odd concept to start with. We have the main character who's telling the story, Gérard Lacasse, and he's going around this old chateau that he used to visit or stay at, and he's taking some friends around and explaining its history back and forth. And the friends begin to see that he's quite emotional about it, so they say, come on, tell us your own story here. And so begins the tale of how Gérard sees the picture of a beautiful woman in a painting, and how he sort of falls in love with it. He becomes obsessed with the woman in that picture and wants to know more about her and find her. And what an interesting concept, how we imprint ideals on something that's affected us. And how maybe in his youth, although I think that's quite a good contrast actually, as I think of it, maybe, potentially, with the older pastor in the other one, that love is something universal and never really dies with age at all. And it can affect the inner tumult of our being quite a lot without any deliberate intent, and often without any rationality. I mean, fancy falling in love with a picture. It's not the picture, it's the woman, the mystique of the woman he's fallen in love with. And so his story is told. The endings to these 2 books are very different as well. It's not like he's following a formal plot. This is character exposition. This is character driven and an investigation of the human condition. How interesting or intriguing does that sound to you? Have any of you read anything by André Gide? I'll read you the first paragraph of La Symphonie Pastorale. First notebook, 10th of February 1890, blank. The snow has been falling continuously for the last 3 days and all the roads are blocked. It has been impossible for me to go to R, where I have been in the habit of holding a service twice a month for the last 15 years. This morning, not more than 30 of my flock were gathered there in La Bravine Chapel. I will take advantage of the leisure this enforced confinement affords me to think over the past and to set down how I came to take charge of Gertrude. I proposed to write here the whole history of her formation and development, for I seem to have called up out of the night her sweet and pious soul for no other end but adoration and love. Blessed be the Lord for having entrusted me with this task. How interesting. So we're on to our 5th book on our list, and this one was written in 1922 by a great German author, and became very popular in the 1960s in the West, particularly. And it is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I know a number of you like Hermann Hesse. Steppenwolf is one that you're always telling me to do a review of on this channel, and I will get round to it. But Siddhartha is a Again, a bit of a philosophical, existential kind of book, because it's the investigation of meaning in life. Now, it takes its place back in ancient India at the time of the Gautama period, Buddha. And Siddhartha, he sets away from his village in a quest to find meaning and enlightenment. And by renouncing a lot of the trappings of normal life. And so he becomes homeless. He experiences hunger. He wants to travel to meet the Buddha. In fact, he meets him and has a conversation with him. And he goes along with his friend, is it Govind or Govinda? And they talk about the things that they've been learning. And they meet different characters along the way. And one of the big themes in this book is, again, I know some of you have said you would like me to start this channel, and I am really thinking about it. But one of the themes in this book is not necessarily tied to any religion. It's just about consciously seeing the world in which we live as a whole. Consciously going about our daily experiences rather than running on autopilot and making everything mundane and only seeking out the fireworks of pleasure as if they're the only things to pay attention to. And so they go along, the two friends. They both meet the Buddha. They both react differently as well. And then we see Siddhartha head towards the city and what happens to him there, and a particular woman that he comes across, and how he begins to weigh up various ideas that he's heard and things he's learned from other people. And then finally, you will see Govinda and Siddhartha meet again. Much further hence in the future, where they then discuss things, and I believe that they don't recognize each other. And so that's interesting to see the outworking of those ideals. So there's a spiritual underpinning to this, a certain interest in the life we lead on the planet and what truly makes for a satisfying life. Because Siddhartha, if I remember rightly, means someone that has achieved the goals. Or achieved an enlightenment. A Buddha means enlightened one, but Siddhartha means you've achieved the understanding of something. So I don't know what to expect of this book. I would say don't be deceived by the thinness. The writing in here is pretty dense and in small type. So normally this book would be probably, I would say, twice the thickness. So if that sounds your cup of tea, then yeah, make a vote for it. So I'll just read the opening paragraph. The son of Brahman. In the shade of the house, in the sunshine of the riverbank near the boats, in the shade of the salwood forest, in the shade of the fig tree is where Siddhartha grew up. The handsome son of the Brahman, the young falcon, together with his friend Govinda, son of a Brahman. The sun tanned his light shoulders by the banks of the river when bathing, performing the sacred ablutions, the sacred offerings. In the mango grove, shade poured into his black eyes when playing as a boy, when his mother sang, when the sacred offerings were made, when his father the scholar taught him, when the wise men talked. For a long time, Siddhartha had been partaking in the discussions of the wise men, practicing debate with Govinda, practicing with Govinda the art of reflection, the service of meditation. He already knew how to speak the Om silently, the word of words, to speak it silently into himself while inhaling, to speak it silently out of himself while exhaling, with all the concentration of his soul, the forehead surrounded by the glow of the clear-thinking spirit. He already knew to feel Atman in the depths of his being, indestructible, one with the universe. So I've just realised that I've stacked my books incorrectly, and so they won't all come out in chronological order, as I said. But the sixth book is from a very well-respected and highly renowned American authoress who I've only read 2 works of. And the last one, although it has one of the best quiet endings in it that I've ever read, just left me so underwhelmed it put me off. But I did come across Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth, and I have heard many of you in the comments mention how much you enjoyed this book. So the story itself follows a very beautiful girl called Lily Bart, if I remember correctly, and she is from a good background, good stock, but she's impoverished, and this threatens to put her out of good society. And so, as needs must back in the day, she's out to find herself an eligible husband so that she can, be brought back into society and have the luxuries that she grew up accustomed to. But there's a problem. She's 29 years old. So she's beautiful, but age is frowned upon in a girl before she, if she's not married by 20, there's something wrong kind of thing. And we follow her endeavours to find a good husband. Now, from what I know, there's 3 main people in there. Now, one, there's something struck me about the names as I read them. A lot of authors like to use particular names. I'll point out something I spotted about them. So one is called Lawrence Salden. And, well, Lawrence I know means like radiated or bright, radiant, Salden, I'm guessing, is like a valley of willows, because Sal is Salix, the willow tree, and Den, a den is a vale or a low meadow. So that's one name. But then you've got, I think, Simon Rosebush. So you've got this link again with plants, but the colour, rose. And I'm thinking of Lawrence Bright, then Simon Rosebush. And then you have Percy Gryce. Gryce, that sounds very much like it's from Latin gris, grey. So I'm interested to see if there's sort of meaning within their names. And that would, I've already got an idea of what those characters would be like based on those names. But one of them apparently she likes, and then the others are better suited to her requirements. Now, we learn that she's incurred some troubles in her own life. Her father's fortune is gone, and she's living with her aunt Julia, who's not the nicest person, but Lily has to rely on her for her accommodation and for food and for her the allowance and any luxuries that she wants. And this tracks, I think it said through 2 years in my research. It tracks her movement in society and the clawing to keep up with society while you're, destined to slip away to the fringes of it. I'll just read the opening paragraph to this book. So book 1, chapter 1. Selden paused in surprise. In the afternoon rush of the Grand Central Station, his eyes had been refreshed by the sight of Miss Lily Bart. It was a Monday in early September, and he was returning to his work from a hurried dip into the country. But what was Miss Bart doing in town at that season? If she had appeared to be catching a train, he might have inferred that he had come on her in the act of transition between one and another of the country houses, which disputed her presence after the close of the Newport season. But her desultory air perplexed him. She stood apart from the crowd, letting it drift by her to the platform or the street, and wearing an air of irresolution which might, as he surmised, be the mask of a very definite purpose. It struck him at once that she was waiting for someone, but he hardly knew why the idea arrested him. There was nothing new about Lily Bart, yet he could never see her without a faint movement of interest. It was characteristic of her that she always roused speculation, that her simplest act seemed the result of far-reaching intentions. I'll be honest, I enjoyed that paragraph. I sort of want to know a bit more. That's very intriguing. So there you are. Edith Wharton, The House of Mirth. That is the 6th book on our list. If you want me to read it, vote for it. So the 7th book on our list was written in 1910 by an author I absolutely love. And it is E.M. Forster's Howard's End. A short book, but E.M. Forster's way of writing, it is so deep and so astute. Now, in the book, Howard's End, your main 2 characters are the Schlegel sisters, Margaret and Helen. And they come from Germany, but they're born half German. But they're pretty much middle-class English people. The favourite cast of people for E.M. Forster's novels. Now, they meet the Wilcoxes in Germany. The Wilcoxes are ever so rich, very affluent, quite strident, quite stuck in the ways of Edwardian England, because of course if they've reached the top in that, they would be, wouldn't they? It reminds you a bit of John Galsworthy's characters in the Forsyte saga. But they want to visit them. So Margaret and Helen go and visit the Wilcoxes in their family, their country seat of Howard's End. Now, when they get there, it's not all about this, but this plays a big role. There's a lot talked about relationships, particularly relationships of the opposite sex, getting engaged, being a bit too rash in making your decisions. So that plays into this book, because Forster was part of the Bloomsbury group, and they, that included Virginia Woolf and Maynard Keynes and Vanessa Bell. So they were interested in talking about certain topics which were off limits to the late Victorian Edwardians. And so he talks about those things. However, there's another family that comes into this, the Basts, and they are impoverished, they're poor. And what you find, although I've not read the book, I do know what this book's about. Helen and Margaret sort of want to help the Basts out, but at the same time, they've got this quite hoity-toity bunch of the Wilcoxes, that family, who look down on others. So they want to help shed them of a lot of their prejudice. They made their money from the colonies. So they want to help them do that and round it all off. But the book will show you the trappings of the anger, annoyance, deceit, treasonous, traitorous instincts that a lot of us have. Because during the interplay of all the characters, people are trying to stab each other in the back and looking out for their own interests. What also adds to this is it's well known that Margaret and Helen are essentially another kind of Marianne and Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. They have very different sentiments or personalities to the way they approach everything. And so there's a certain conflict amongst the way they deal with things, and yet a great way to analyse across the spectrum of our behaviours. I don't want to say any more because it's a short book. I mean, about 200 pages, maybe just under. So I don't want to give anything away to you in case you want to read it. I know the story, but I haven't actually read it myself, and there's nothing like reading E.M. Forster. So if you would like me to read that one next month and then come back and review it, you know what to do. Vote down below, and in a few days or so, or weeks, I will choose the book and read it. So there you go, Howard's End. Let's just read the opening paragraph. One may as well begin with Helen's letters to her sister. Howard's End, Tuesday. Dearest Meg, it isn't going to be what we expected. It is old and little and altogether delightful red brick. We can scarcely pack in as it is, and the dear knows what will happen when Paul, the younger son, arrives tomorrow. From hall, you go right or left into dining room or drawing room. Hall itself is practically a room. You open another door in it, and there are the stairs going up in a sort of tunnel to the first floor. 3 bedrooms in a row there, and 3 attics in a row above. That isn't all the house, really, but it's all that one notices. 9 windows as you look up from the front garden. Do you know what I love about that? There is a certain Austinian mannerism about the letter writing, isn't there? Writing back and forth to each other. I do love letters. They're so intimate, private, and yet they are full of the most innocuous things because you're describing where you are. And I'm guessing, from what I know of the story, that Meg is supposedly coming to Howard's End and Helen is just writing the details to prepare her when she gets there. So that gives you a great insight into a character straight away. The way they talk, the things they notice. So there you go, Howard's End. That's our 7th book. For our 8th book, I wonder if you've even heard of this writer. You may have known the title to this book. In fact, I only knew the title and know nothing else about it. So I've done a tiny bit of research to share it with you. But it is Elizabeth Bowen's The Death of the Heart. Now, this, in its time, was very well received and had quite a lot of acclaim to it. But like I say, I only know the title. So, the story. We have a young girl called Portia. She's 16 years old, and we learn that her parents have died, and she's sent to live with, I believe it's her aunt. And her aunt is Anna, and her husband Thomas. But as the story progresses, we begin to sense that Portia is odd. We learn that apparently through the reactions of others. Now, before I carry on, just say Elizabeth Bowen said this was definitely an interwar book, an intergenerational book as well, because that generation before, into the 30s, when it was written, it had seen the rise of the individual. You think of the Edwardians I just talked about in Howard's End. There was a structure and society behaved in a certain way and you fit your place, you were the cog in the machine. After the First World War, the whole thing fell apart. The trust in the system and the institutions was totally and utterly lost. And so you had the rise of the individual. And people were very aware of their relationships with each other and their interactions with each other. Portia comes into this scene with an unawareness. She's got a naivety of why do people say things they don't mean? Why do people behave towards certain people that maybe they don't like as if they like them? She can't put her finger on it. And so what Portia does in this book, which I think is fascinating, is she starts to keep a diary of people around her, observing their behaviours. Now, Anna and Thomas do not like her in the house. They find it uncomfortable to have her around. They're always trying to get her out. But, you know, family is family. You've got to do your bit. Excuse me with my nose, something's tickling it. And so imagine the surprise when someone discovers and begins reading Portia's diary. They are horrified that she is taking such a minute interest in everyone's dealings. And what would happen if Portia discovered someone was reading her diary? How would Portia respond? That's sort of part of this book. Now, what I do know about this book is it has an unexpected ending. I don't mean twist in the tale. I know it has a tragic ending, but I don't believe it's fatal. It's unusual. It's tragic like you wouldn't expect. And so I'm curious about reading the ending and how it all works out. What I'm going to do now is give you an idea, first time reading through for me, of the writing style of this book by reading the first paragraph or two, whatever. Okay, here we go. Part 1, The World. That morning's ice, no more than a brittle film, had cracked and was now floating in segments. These, tapped together or parting, left channels of dark water down which swans in slow indignation swam. The island stood in frozen woody brown dusk. It was now between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. A sort of breath from the clay from the city outside the park condensing made the air unclear. Through this, the trees round the lake soared frigidly up. Bronze cold of January bound the sky and the landscape. The sky was shut to the sun, but the swans, the rims of the ice, the pallid withdrawn Regency terraces had an unnatural burnish as though cold were light. There is something momentous about the height of winter. Steps rang on the bridges and along the black walks. This weather had set in. It would freeze harder tonight. Goodness me, that's good. Wow. Now that is an opening paragraph and a half. By the way, would you like me to do a video on the incipit? I've always thought about doing it. The incipit's the opening line of a book, so important. But you can stretch it and make it the opening paragraph, because opening paragraphs can do a lot to a book. Now that, talk about setting a tone, setting an atmosphere. The story clearly isn't going to take place at this, wherever this water is, this river. It's going to move away from there. But it sets the tone of the whole book. You know, the brittle film, that morning's ice cracked. It's dark channels of waters. We have the black walks. You have the slow indignation of the swans. You have the bronze cold of January. That is wonderful. Which is, what did it say about the bronze cold? that it bound the landscape. The sky was shut to the sun, unnatural burnish, and then something momentous about the height of winter. That's brilliant. There is a claustrophobia in all of this writing. There is something off kilter because the sun is there, but everything's bound against it. The cold is light, not light itself. Things are oppressed and trapped, but something momentous is coming. There's a huge amount in that first paragraph. So that was Elizabeth Bowen's The Death of the Heart. If you want me to read that, vote for it, and I'll read it next month and get back to you. Our ninth book is a 1970 classic that has been adored by a multitude of people. It's actually all truth. It's all a true story. And it's all epistolary as well. It's quite literally a living epistolic tale. Meaning, by the way, that it's written in letters back and forth between people. And it's Helaine Hanff's 84 Charing Cross Road. I know plenty of you here have already read this. I've known about it for a long time, just haven't got round to it, and then found it for 50 pence. Basically, in 1949, Helaine Hanff in America, she was on the hunt for obscure classic books, and she couldn't find them in New York. And then she saw an ad in the Saturday Literary Review of a company called Marks & Co, specialising in classic books in London. And so she wrote a letter. And the first person to respond to that letter was the owner, Mark Dole, and he wrote back. And by postal order would send books over there. Sometimes they would find books in the shop and think of Helaine Hanff and write to her and say, "We've got this, would you like it?" Now the correspondence between them, and not just between Hanff and Dole, but between many of the members that worked at Marks & Co Books and their family members, the letters began going back and forth for 20 years. And great friendships were forged through letters. In fact, Hanff was able to send things over, like during the wartime, she was able to, during ration time, she was able to send over some food, Christmas gifts like a turkey. The idea was reciprocated back. And the story is just of all of them getting to know each other and great friendships being forged, particularly between Mark Dole and Helaine Hanff. And all of the conversations that they discuss, whether it's literature and poetry, whether it's sport, whether it's illnesses, whether it's whatever you imagine, they just talk about things. And Hanff has got a great way of writing. She's quite abrupt, deliberately teasing the workers at Marks & Co Books. Once you've read this book, then go and read more about the characters. Don't read about the characters before you've read this book. Because honestly, once you've read the book, you'll be absolutely enchanted. I've read some of it, and I was enchanted just with the little bit I read. But once you've read it and they're enchanted, it will add so much when you then read about them later on in life. So that's 84 Charing Cross Road. What I'll do now is I'll read, perhaps, the opening letter, because they are all very short, the letters back and forth. They're like that. I think you can see that. So, gentlemen, your ad in the Saturday Review of Literature says that you specialise in out-of-print books. The phrase antiquarian booksellers scares me somewhat, as I equate antique with expensive. I am a poor writer with an antiquarian taste in books, and all the things I want are impossible to get over here, except in very expensive rare editions, or in Barnes & Noble's grimy marked-up schoolboy copies. I enclose a list of my most pressing problems. If you have clean second-hand copies of any of the books on the list, for no more than $5 each, will you consider this a purchase order and send them to me? Very truly yours, Helaine Hanff. And that's how an extraordinary friendship began. The 10th book on our list is the oldest of all of them, and the oldest by a long shot. The reason it's come at the end, when I wanted to start with the earliest, is I ended up putting it at the bottom of the pile because it was the first one I set aside. And it is William Langland's The Visions of Piers Plowman. Now, this book was written somewhere between 1375 and 1385. Now, to give you an idea of what was going on in Britain at that time, the Black Death had hit. And had ravaged the nation. Of course, it's well known that about a third of the European population was lost to the Black Death. This threw so many things into tumult in its day. It suddenly gave power to the people because workers could charge more for their labour. They could simply leave lands and get employed by another baron or lord, go into the city, whatever it was. It also had shot a hole in the ability of the nobility and of the church to protect the people, because this visitation, which seemed from God, would have condemned the church, and it showed the powerlessness of humans. So Piers Plowman, or the tales or the visions of Piers Plowman, are written at this time. And what happens is we get a piece of literature which is unrhymed, but is full of alliteration to help people remember it, which recounts attitudes and dispositions and musings on life in a time of such change that the world rarely ever gets to see. And it's all taken from the perspective of a ploughman, so a peasant. And the story starts where Will is the name of the guy. Will falls asleep and is by a river, and he sees a vision. And he sees a valley with a dungeon or a fortress in it, and high on a hill, a tower, the Tower of Truth. And it's sort of a contrast of heaven and hell. And between the two is a field full of folk. In other words, all the people of the world, all the strata of society, all the different characters and dispositions that people have. And so he begins to learn about those things. And he meets lots of allegorical characters like Lady Mead. Mead means payment and wealth, payment of money. And Mead is going to marry false, so falsehood. But the king doesn't want that, and you have he wants Mead, or Lady Mead, he wants her to marry Conscience, but Conscience will have nothing to do with it, conscience and wealth and all that kind of thing. And so there's musings on morality and what is right and proper and godliness and the role of the king. The king in this appears as an allegorical cat with all of the rats as his servants or his people beneath him. And the discontent between the rats and the cat, that's very interesting, considering it may have been written shortly before the Peasants' Revolt, which is in 1381. This brooding, simmering sense of unease in the country and dissatisfaction with the ruling elite. That's all in here. Now, it goes through various stages where he falls asleep and then wakes up and then he falls asleep again. For instance, one of the big things is he searches out three characters. Do well, do better, and do best. Okay, so three different ideas of the way you live characters. He also talks about the travails that people go through and how some of it's brought on by themselves. The 7 deadly sins are in here. So you've got gluttony, for instance, and you've got sloth, and you've got envy. And imagine hearing this story at this time. It's not all one big story. There's actually 3 texts. But imagine this story. It gives you an insight into the medieval mind. And actually, with just common sense and observation, how little has changed. People still pursue the wrong things today that were talked about back in the 14th century. As long as someone pauses to think about it. Now, I don't fully know his conclusions. I don't fully know everything about this story, but it holds a very central pivot point in British history, literature history, because, you're talking about the common man. And like I say, this is before Chaucer turned up and really made the common story available for everyone with the Canterbury Tales. So I got hold of this, and I will be reading it at some point. I don't know when, but if you vote for it, it will be next month. And it will be a slower read for me, because when you're trying to adjust to the medieval writing. You can understand it, but it slows you right down. For instance, I've got William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, written in 1526. You can understand it, but it's slow because Dent's writing and the spelling is totally different, as it comes before the great vowel shift of the 17th century. I'll just read you the opening 12 lines of this. In a summer season, when soft was the sun, I shoot me into shrouds, as I a sheep were. In habit as an hermit, unholy of works, went wide in this world wonders to hear. That's and. On a May morning, on Malvern Hills, me biffle a furly of fairy methought. I was weary of wandered, and went me to rest under a brood bank by a bourne's side. And as I lay, and leaned, and looked on the waters, I slumbered into a sleeping, it swayed so merry. Fain gan me to meeten a marvellous sweven, that I was in a wilderness, wist I never were. As I beheld into the east and high to the sun, I see a tor on a toft traylicky marked, a deep dale beneath, a dungeon therein, with deep ditches and dirk and dreadful of sight, and fair field full of folk fond in there between. Fond is found. Now, you may not have recognised all the words, and neither would I, but it's got the accompanying explanation to certain words. But did you hear the rhythm of that? You know, it didn't rhyme, but the amount of alliteration that was in that. The fair field full of folk. I understood that he lay down by a river. I understood that he had, wandered like a sheep, that he saw a vision where he knew not where. He says he wandered into this place, which I didn't know where it was. And it's, a wilderness. Yeah, I understand what he's saying. It all happened on a May morning in the Malvern Hills. Hear the alliteration, on a May morning on the Malvern Hills. So this is quite a piece of art, really. If you want me to read it and then get back to you on it, then vote for it. Have you read The Vision of Piers Plowman yourself? Here comes my cat. You might see his tail. So that was the 10th one. So there are all 10 of the books. You may want to go back and recap which ones there were. What I'd love you to do is vote. Which one would you like me to read next month? And then I will come back to you and give you my honest thoughts on it. I may as well say at this point, if you subscribe to my other channel, which is about more up-to-date works, YouTube have recommended that I take those videos and put them into this channel, that it doesn't work very well to split similar topics into two channels. And so I may start introducing, amongst the majority of classic works, some of the more modern works that I read right here on this channel, where it will just be simply a book review of a modern book that I've read and share my thoughts with you. But don't unsubscribe from that channel, because I'm pretty sure I am going to make the channel into about slow living, about thoughtful living, about getting de-stressed and enjoying day-to-day life and the way we hamper ourselves so much. So I'm going to share my little passion there, which is a big part of how I live. And it actually might help me to have that channel instead of two book channels, because that puts a lot of strain. It's thrown out of kilter my normal equilibrium of how I try to go about living. So anyway, enough of that. Don't forget to cast a vote and to hit the subscribe button and share if you know anyone that loves literature. Sharing and subscribing helps me no end with this channel. So I thank you for your support. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.